Let's talk about a really common but incredibly frustrating problem in clinical practice: bacterial vaginosis. It affects millions of women, but our standard antibiotic treatments often fall short, leading to this vicious cycle of recurrence. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into the evidence for a totally different way of thinking about it, using probiotics to restore the body's natural microbial balance.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First up, we'll lay out exactly why BV is such a tough clinical challenge. Then, we'll dive straight into a major meta-analysis to see what the evidence says about probiotics. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how these probiotics actually work. And finally, we'll wrap up by thinking about what all this means for the future of microbiome therapy.
So, let's start with the basics. Why is bacterial vaginosis, or BV, such a persistent problem in gynecology? And why is it pushing clinicians to look for solutions beyond just antibiotics?
Well, for starters, the scale of the problem is just immense. We're talking about a worldwide prevalence of over 20% in adult women. And in some parts of the world, that number skyrockets to over 60%. So this is not some rare condition. It is a major global health issue.
Okay, so what is BV, really? This is what's so fascinating from a pathophysiological standpoint. It's not a classic infection with one single bad guy. It's a state of dysbiosis. You can think of it as a complete ecological collapse. The key event is a huge drop in the population of protective, hydrogen peroxide-producing lactobacillus species. When they disappear, it leaves a vacuum, allowing a whole community of other bacteria, like Gardnerella vaginalis, to overgrow.
And this is exactly why we can't just ignore BV, even when a patient is asymptomatic. This dysbiosis is far from benign. It's linked to a whole cascade of really serious clinical consequences. Everything from pelvic inflammatory disease and a higher risk of getting STIs like HIV, to infertility and really terrible pregnancy outcomes like preterm birth.
So how do we usually treat this? Well, the standard of care, the first thing we reach for is a course of broad-spectrum antibiotics, usually metronidazole or clindamycin. The logic is simple: wipe out the overgrown bacteria that are causing all the problems.
But here's the paradox. This is where the whole approach starts to fall apart. While antibiotics are great in the short term, we're talking cure rates over 70%. They completely fail in the long run. Just look at that recurrence rate. More than half of patients will relapse within 6 months. And it makes sense, right? The antibiotics are a blunt instrument. They kill the bad guys, but they do absolutely nothing to bring back the good guys, leaving that ecosystem just as vulnerable as it was before.
This massive recurrence rate is exactly why we need a different strategy. If the core problem is a broken ecosystem, maybe the answer isn't just killing things off, but actively rebuilding it. And that brings us to probiotics. So, let's see what a major 2023 meta-analysis has to say about whether they actually work.
Just to make sure we're all on the same page, what exactly are we talking about with probiotics? Well, the World Health Organization defines them as live microorganisms, which, when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit to the host. The idea here for BV is pretty straightforward. Let's reintroduce those beneficial lactobacillus strains to help repopulate the microbiome and get things back to a healthy state. In a 2023 meta-analysis published in Clinical and Experimental Obstetrics and Gynecology, dropped some really exciting news on the short-term front. It found a risk ratio of 0.11 for BV recurrence at about 30 days. Let me translate that. Patients taking probiotics had an 89% lower risk of their BV coming back in that first month compared to the control group. That is a huge signal.
But, and this is a really important but, the story isn't that simple. The very same study raised a major red flag about how long this effect lasts. The authors concluded, and I'm quoting here, "Short-term efficacy may be satisfactory, but the long-term efficacy may be suboptimal." This really gets to the core of the whole clinical debate right now. So what's going on here? Why does the effect seem to just fade away? Well, when the researchers dug into the data, they found a lot of heterogeneity across the different studies. Specifically, the trials that followed patients for longer, more than 60 days, showed a much weaker benefit, or sometimes no benefit at all. This suggests the positive effect just doesn't stick around after you stop taking the probiotics, and it screams for more research into the best strains, doses, and how long treatment should last.
Okay, so even if the effect is mainly short-term for now, it's still a real effect. So the question is, how is it working? Let's peel back the layers and get into the biological mechanisms, and we'll focus on a particularly clever trick some of these probiotics have up their sleeve.
You know, one of the biggest hurdles for any oral probiotic is simply surviving the journey. The stomach is an incredibly harsh, acidic environment. It's like sending a soldier through a bath of acid. But some bacteria, like Bacillus coagulans, have this incredible survival tactic. They form a spore. It's basically a tiny armored capsule that lets them pass through that acid gauntlet completely unharmed.
And this diagram here shows that amazing journey perfectly. You can see how the spore form just sails right through the mouth and stomach over several hours. It's dormant, it's protected, and it's only when it gets to the much friendlier environment of the intestines that it decides to wake up and get to work. Let's break that down.
So it all happens in 3 key stages. Stage 1 is all about survival, just getting through the stomach. Then comes stage 2, germination. Once it hits the small intestine, the spore senses the change in environment and transforms into an active, living bacterial cell. And finally, you have stage 3, action and resporulation. The active bacterium does its job, exerts its probiotic effects, and then, before it gets to the colon, it turns back into a spore to be safely passed out of the body. It's an incredibly efficient delivery system.
So once they're active, how do these probiotics actually influence the vaginal microbiome? Well, they launch this multi-pronged attack. They produce lactic acid, which is crucial for lowering the vaginal pH back down below 4.5. They secrete these little antimicrobial weapons called bacteriocins. They physically get in the way, preventing pathogens from sticking to the vaginal walls. They break up harmful biofilms, and they even help repair the epithelial barrier. It's a systemic effect, likely mediated through what we call the gut-vagina axis.
Okay, let's zoom back out. We've gone through the problem, the evidence, and the mechanism. So what does this all mean for us in the clinic? What are the big takeaways, and where do we go from here?
So here's where we stand. On one side of the ledger, what we know is that probiotics are a really promising tool to use alongside antibiotics. They have strong short-term data to back them up, and the biological mechanism makes a lot of sense. But on the other side, what we need is pretty clear. We need more high-quality, large-scale clinical trials to figure out the best strains, the right doses, and for how long, with a huge focus on what happens in the long term.
And all of this leads us to a final, really fascinating question about the future of medicine. For so long, our approach to infections has been about killing things. But the evidence here suggests we might be at a turning point. Are we moving away from the era of just finding the right antibiotic and moving toward a new era of microbiome therapy, where treatment is all about curating and cultivating a patient's own unique microbial ecosystem to keep them healthy? It's a provocative thought, and hopefully future research will give us the answer.